And you are live.
Thank you. We'd like to call the Finance and Infrastructure Committee meeting to order. With that, I would ask that Pam, you take a assessment of the members present, please, for a quorum.
Certainly. Chair Balducci.
Here.
Regent Gray Kemp. Absence is noted. Regent Jimenez.
Here.
Regent Ryan.
Here.
Regent Santiago. Absence is noted. And ex officio Regent Pitts.
David, you're on mute.
Oh, here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Regent Balducci, you have a quorum.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. The first item on our agenda today is approval of the minutes of the September 15th meeting. Is there a motion?
Moved.
Thank you, David. A second. Thank you very much for that, Joanne. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The minutes are approved. All right, we have two action items and one information item. Beth is going to go through two of them, both very important items, both which apply to both the community colleges and the universities and have a great deal of impact on them. So with that, we'll move to the first action item, adoption of the revised CSU distribution model for CSU state aid. With that, Ben?
Thank you very much. As you all know, we receive a block grant, two block grants, three actually, one for the universities, one for the community colleges, and one for Charter Oak. The board policy going back to 2009 requires that the state universities distribution model, the way that we divide up the money amongst the universities, be reviewed every 2 years. While we continually review the policy, at least during my tenure, I can assert that the subject comes up and we review regularly. It has been very difficult to achieve consensus on making changes. The overall number hasn't changed much. I mean, it goes up a little bit each year typically, but has remained relatively consistent. And there are features of the existing distribution model which disadvantage various campuses, and naturally each campus has generally focused on those items which disadvantage them, and it's been hard to agree on a package of changes that would improve the distribution. However, this year there was an increase in state assistance to the universities with implementation of a new $22.5 million support for operating fund fringe benefits. That, coupled with the remarkable changes in enrollment that we've experienced recently, and a desire to address some of the long simmering issues with the formula, brought us to the table to undertake a even more in-depth review of the distribution model. We have made where the item before you makes some significant changes to the distribution model. I'm going to walk through them very quickly, but I'll take any questions anybody has. First of all, the original model is included the one we're proposing to replace, had three principal features. One was a base funding level of $6.5 million. That had been a reflection of what it costs to hire the sort of core cadre of employees who must run a university. That number was established more than a decade ago. In addition, there was additional funding for specified items, and there was a lengthy list of those specified items. They included far-ranging things that had been established by the legislature at some point in the past. They included changes in square footage of university buildings, although that lately has not been much of a factor because we have not been building a lot of new square footage in the university buildings, and a whole series of minor adjustments. They didn't really impact the distribution of funds in a material way, but they added significant complexity to the calculation of the formula each year, and were a source of dispute as to how we interpret various items in that list. So there was the base funding, the additional items, and then there's variable funding based on the student count. A few years ago, we changed to using a 3-year rolling average of your student count. That student count has historically excluded part-time students and includes a weighting system so that the in-state students are weighted 2.5 times higher than out-of-state students. So we run this formula to come up with a head count at each institution using that particular measure, and then we allocate the remaining funds using that variable method. The new formula makes a few changes. We increased the fixed funding from $6.5 million to $11 million, which I think is more in line with I mean, there have been lots and lots of inflation, and having a stronger base funding tends to make the funding stream less volatile and more predictable for the universities. We have eliminated additional funding for specified items. You know, when you looked at the list and the financial impact on each of the universities, it seemed like a lot of accounting and a lot of keeping track of things for no benefit and no impact on the distribution of funds. So we've eliminated that. Obviously, if the legislature passes new mandates for one or another university, we will have to accommodate that in the model. But we can do that in different ways. We can actually fund those legislative mandates out of the system office, which would allow us to share the cost of those mandates across the entire system. And then the variable funding remains, but we've included part-time students in the calculation. Obviously, that impacts different campuses. Central and to some degree Southern were disadvantaged by the absence of part-time students in the calculation. So we have added that in. All of these changes impacted different universities in different ways, and the total of this package of items, oh, I'm sorry, there's one fourth item. We've also made a change in how we allocate fringe benefit support from the state. Previously, fringe benefits dollars from the state were allocated based on enrollment, the same measure of enrollment that was used in the underlying formula. We've changed that to be based on the cost of fringe benefits at each campus. So under this new model, every campus has 24% of its fringe benefits expenses covered by the block grant. And then there's the additional funding that came, the operating fund fringe benefit support, which brings the total level up higher. But each campus's fringe benefit support coming out of the formula is based on the cost of the fringe benefits that that campus must offer. So previously it had somewhat distorted and disadvantaged, interestingly, Southern, who has slightly higher fringe benefit costs per student than other campuses. So these changes in total affect the distribution in some ways that I think are pretty reasonable. The one campus I think that probably does best out of this, to be fully blunt about it, is Western. Western had been significantly disadvantaged by several features of the formula and had fewer offsets. And I think that that's reflected in the fact that Western has had more financial difficulties in recent years. I think some of that could be attributable to the way that the distribution model awarded funds to Western. So Western ended up getting about $7 or $8 million of additional funding from this distribution model. Central and Southern each get about $5 million and about $3 million for Eastern. These are, I believe, in line with what the data suggests each campus ought to get, and I think provide a fair way to distribute, a fair and simple way to distribute these funds going forward. There are a couple of things I want to point out. One is that the additional operating fund fringe benefits that were provided in this biennial budget, in the event that that is discontinued or restructured, or there are other substantial changes to the state aid that we receive, we all understood that we would need to revisit this spending model. That if that were taken off the table, that would disadvantage several of the institutions quite a bit, and would prompt us to begin to revisit the distribution again. I think that, in one sense, goes without saying, but I wanted to be very clear that all the universities who participated in this process wanted to be sure that in the event that there's a change in state aid, we go back to the table and revisit the distribution model.
Ben, who decides whether we revisit it or not? One of the universities can call for that kind of
Well, we're required to look at it every 2 years. And so I assume that we will look at it again in 2 years anyways,
right,
at the time that the next biennial budget comes out. Obviously, it is, you know, we have a tradition of adopting a distribution model based on consensus amongst the 4 universities. We have that consensus. We had a meeting with the university presidents and the CFOs and leadership from the system office, and we went over the distribution model, and they all agreed that this was a good way forward. I think I would like to personally commend all of them for accepting various compromises in order to get to that point. It clearly entails that. Nobody got exactly what they wanted out of this, but we all, I think, have a pretty fair approach. The only other, so that's all, just that we clearly are going to continue to operate under the 2009 resolution that requires us to review this every 2 years, but we have what I hope is a fair system for now, and I hope going forward it's certainly a simpler and more transparent system and easier for anyone to understand. I'm happy to take any questions.
Any questions by members of the committee on this?
Ben.
Saying compromises made by all of the universities is somewhat unusual.
Yeah.
Yes.
Ben, I think from my perspective, what you said in response to the committee chairman's question is one of the most important items of information. I think you said every university president and university CFO is in agreement with this new model. Is that accurate?
Yes.
And what about Charter Oak and the community colleges?
Charter Oak none of them are involved in this particular formula. The Charter Oak gets it's a block grant that goes explicitly to Charter Oak, and that number is set by the legislature. Community colleges have a distribution model as well that is similar in general outlines, but a little bit different than the universities. I would argue that the distribution model that the colleges have has some of the same equity concerns that the university distribution model had. However, given the pending merger of the colleges, I prefer the approach that we've been taking has been to allow that distribution model to end at the when we convert, presumably in fiscal 24. We will no longer have need for a distribution model because there will be a single block grant, there will be a single college, and the expenses of those colleges will be paid out of the budget, and we as an administration, you as a board, will have to provide you with new ways of evaluating the fairness of the distribution of those funds amongst the various activities and locations in the community college system.
One more question, Ben. The documents that were circulated for today's meeting reference a CSU distribution model review committee. Is that committee different from the 4 university presidents and CFOs? If so, who's on that committee?
The committee that did the work was the CFOs of the universities, myself and Melantina Pousse, who's the budget director and who's been executing the formula for some time. I know that the universities all had some additional staff participate as well, but it was principally the 4 chief financial officers and myself and Melantina with some additional staff support, and then we brought that to a committee, not a formal committee, but we brought our final recommendations to a group meeting of the 4 university presidents in order to give everybody a last opportunity to raise any concerns or to indicate their support for the final package. But they obviously, individual campuses had worked through their support for this package during the process.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Any other questions, Joanne or David?
Yes, I do have a couple of questions. First of all, I think that it does seem to be a general improvement in terms of including the part-time students and eliminating the specified or special items. But I do have a concern on page 6 of the agenda for today, the staff report, which says a portion of the block grant will continue to be assessed to support system office operations. The amount of these funds will be established by the BOR within its approval of the annual spending plan. My concern is that there is no specified limit to the size of the system office relative to the total block grants for the universities themselves. And I've done a calculation that the system office is now at 171 staff. That's an increase from the previous time I did this about 1.5 years ago, which was at approximately 145. That's a 15% increase in the size just of the system office. And I'm concerned that with the kind of language that's on page 6, that kind of expansion of the central office or the system office will continue to the detriment of the constituent institutions. So that's one concern that I have. And for the record, what I'm going to say, since I don't have the ability to move an amendment, there should be a fixed percentage of total revenues that can be allocated to the system office to prevent that kind of bureaucratic bloat. So that's my first point. I have a couple of other points, but I wonder if there's any comments on that.
Sure. I would, first of all, I think it's helpful to point out that the system office, just trying to get to the right page of the I'm sorry, I don't have multi-year projections here, or history of the budget, but the system office that we're describing here in the item before you is the Connecticut State University system office, which has been consistent. I mean, I don't have the figures in front of me. The level of staff supported by the CSU system office budget may go up or down slightly from one year to the next based on whatever vacancies occur or what have you. But there has been no growth. In fact, I believe this year the dollar amount for the system office in the university share of the system office may have actually gone down slightly or been flat, and has been typically very flat. Obviously, the growth in staffing that you're describing is the result of staff mostly in the EMSA area, so registrars, financial aid officials, and enrollment managers who were previously identified as employees of individual community college campuses are now have been moved into a shared service organization, which I believe you're capturing within your assessment of the system office. So, you know, as you move employees from one unit of the organization into another, it does appear that organization the center is growing. In that case, the overall community college system has not grown. And I also would point out it's not really, in this case, the distribution model for the universities does not support the one college in any way, does not support the merger of the community colleges in any way. It supports relatively limited functioning at the system office to pay for assistance with budgeting, assistance with financial reporting, assistance with legal and executive leadership and labor relations. Those are the somewhat limited scope services that the system office provides to the universities. Those are covered by the allocation of CSU block grant to the system office. And as I said, that number has been consistent and has not changed materially in the last several years, although I have to pull detailed numbers to provide you. I don't have them in front of me, I'm afraid.
Those numbers would be helpful, although of course my concern also has to do with the growth of the centralization at the level of the community colleges, but that's a topic for another day. My second concern was about, or question really, was about additional fringe benefits, because that is, my understanding is that's a one-time, or at any rate, linked to the current biennial budget of the state. Do we have projections of what is going to happen into the future past, say, fiscal year 2024?
Obviously, we had some significant, the answer is no. The determination of the future state budgets is in others' hands. Although we are certainly intending to maintain the position that I am taking with the legislature is that funding, while enacted for this biennium, should be reenacted for future bienniums going into the future, and frankly, that the state ought to find additional resources to assist the CSCU, or in this case, the university system, to sustain operations after 2022. As you know, and we'll talk about it in a minute, the budget for the current year at the university system relies on nearly $50 million of non-recurring federal assistance. And so the ask to the state is generally going to include that they sustain all the funding that's in place now, and that they assist us in meeting the shortfall that will likely arise when federal funding sunsets, and nobody, I think, reasonably believes that we will immediately recover enough enrollment to fill that budget hole next year. So we're going to be asking for even more resources from the state for the upcoming for next year, and then for the new biennium a year from now.
Okay, there's another question which comes to my mind, but not for discussion now, which is, what would the figure be for full funding of, for example, the university system? I realize that that's not a question that you can answer right off the bat, although perhaps you can, but that's something which I would like to. I've been asked on many occasions. One of the persistent questions that faculty have is, what would be the amount of full funding that we need from the state of Connecticut in order to properly finance our institutions of public higher education, in particular the universities? So that's something I would request on the side, perhaps for a later time. My final point is that I was a little disappointed in the staff report, because it does seem to me that the only table here is on the question of the additional fringe benefits. But it would have been interesting, and I think actually important and informative, if we would have had a comparison of the current funding model and what it contributes, and the proposed one, along with, say, a projection through the next 2 to 4 years. And that's just a suggestion for improvement.
Mr. Chairman.
David.
Well, before I go, let me just yield to Regent Ryan if she has any questions.
You're muted, Joanne. Joanne, you're muted.
Still
muted.
can't hear
You're
you,
still
Joanne.
muted. You're,
Joanne, you're still muted.
Joanne, if you wish to speak, unmute your computer. I don't know how we fix that.
Can't fix that from my controls.
David, why don't you go ahead, and if Joanne is able to comment along the way, we'll take her call, okay?
Okay, thank
Okay
you.
with you, Joanne?
Just for the record, for the minutes, I want to state that I disagree with Professor Blitz's first concern. I don't think that it would be appropriate for us to require any kind of limit on the system office operations right now, as the organization as a whole continues to evolve due to the Student First initiative, the accreditation process. But I am comfortable that any assessment or review of funds for the system office will be done with the same transparency and brought before the Board of Regents in a public meeting if there's any change. Is that a fair assumption, Ben?
Yes, absolutely. The amount of the system office budget is a major component of the budget each year and is available for review as part of that process. I also, just as a matter of thinking as a sort of a legislative matter, for a board to establish a limit that they then on their future selves is a somewhat pointless exercise, because the board, should you wish to spend 10 times more on the system office next year, that is your prerogative to do, and a limit you place on yourselves today will not be binding on you tomorrow, and so I generally I don't think that kind of limitation is effective, or it's a symbolic limitation, which I suppose has value.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessary nor advisable for the reasons I mentioned. And I think given the transparency of the budgeting process, it's essentially moot in my view. I am also going back to my initial point. I am very pleased that this review process that was done was so inclusive with the CFOs of the universities, and ultimately with support, unanimous support of the university president. So I think it's well thought, it's well developed, and I'm confident.
Thank you, David. Any other comments by any members before we put this to a vote? Joanne?
I'm back. I'm on, and finally, something's really screwed. We had a problem with our whole system this morning, so, but I'm back. I'm, I can mute and unmute now. So I have no
Great.
questions.
Yeah,
I'm all
no
set.
questions.
No questions.
Appreciate that. Thank you, Joanne. Further discussion? If not, I'd ask for a motion for adoption of the resolution.
So moved.
David, is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Joanne. All those in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Okay.
Opposed? Resolution's adopted. Thank you. Moving on to the next item on our agenda, it's the revised spending plan for universities and community colleges. This one a little complex, at least for me, going through some of the numbers. Ben will take his time, I'm sure, and answer any questions we may have dealing with this. So with that, I'd like to, again, turn it over to our CFO, Ben Barnes.
Thank you very much. So before you, I have a set of proposed revisions to the spending plans for the community colleges and for the universities. The charter oak spending plan remains fine. There are no concerns with Charter Oak. They are on track to generally meet their enrollment targets. The reason that we need to do this is that our enrollment expectations for the fall were not met with the census that we undertook in mid-September that reflects our fall enrollment. There's a table on page 11 of the agenda packet, which shows the change in enrollment between what we actually got last year, what we had budgeted for this year, and what we are now our revised projection for the year. The numbers that you see there are full-time equivalents, which is the most helpful for projecting tuition and fee revenue because the part-timers pay less in tuition and fees. The way we typically calculate enrollment for tuition setting, for establishing tuition revenue, is to take the average of the full-time equivalent enrollment in the spring and the fall, and to use that as a single number to track enrollment, the connection between enrollment and revenue. That ignores, winter intersession and summer revenue, which are significant but tend not to vary as much from one year to the next and have less of an impact on our revenue. So as you can see in the universities, we in 21 we had enrollment of 23,359. We originally thought that was going to go up by about 100 to 23,458, but instead of going up by 100, we actually went down to 21,795 is our new projection for the year. So we're down 7.1% compared to the original budget, and down 6.7% compared to the 21 actuals. The community colleges, the numbers we had actually projected, not a huge increase, but we had projected an increase from 20,817 to 22,721. So an increase of about 900 students, 1,900 students, just under 10%. Now, a 10% increase in enrollment does sound like an aggressive enrollment assumption, and with the brilliant vision of 2020 hindsight, I can say it was obviously too high. But we were coming off of a drop of about 16, 17% the year before. So we had assumed that we were, because of the presence of the vaccine, and at the time, before the emergence of the Delta variant, we're optimistic that a return to substantial in-person teaching in the fall of 2021 would allow us to regain a little bit more than half of our lost enrollment. That obviously things changed. The Delta variant came out. We were unable to schedule as much of our course schedule in person as we had assumed would be the case last spring, because the continuing COVID restrictions on populating classrooms, et cetera. So we ended up with enrollment of 20,295, which is down very slightly from the prior year, down 2% from the year before, 2 or 3%, but it's down almost 11% from what we had planned in our budget. The consequences of these changes are significant drop-off in tuition and fee revenue, which we must address. In addition, there are some other changes that flow from these enrollment changes, and some which are unrelated but are included in this package. So the universities and colleges have made revisions to their part-time staffing budgets and other staffing budgets to reflect newer information about the number of adjuncts that were going to be needed to cover the schedule in the colleges and universities. So though there were some revisions there, we were also able to accommodate updated information about our fringe benefit support from the state. We were relying on preliminary estimates when we established our spending plan. We now have actual fringe benefit rates, which are reflected in the revised spending plan. We also, in order to deal with the significant drop-off in revenue, there have been some changes at both the universities and the colleges to the use of HERF funds to support the budget. In the universities, there was a small amount of unallocated HERF funds at Central, which they have brought to bear under this revised spending plan as lost revenue to backfill for some of the tuition weakness. In the colleges, there was a significant allocation of HERF funds away from other activities and into the lost revenue category to support our budget this year. In addition, so let me start with a little bit more detail about the universities, and then I'll move on to the colleges. So the universities started the budget, their budget as adopted had a $2 million, had a surplus of about $18 million. I don't have the exact number right in front of me. And they've essentially used some new HERF funds and the additional revenue that had been brought to bear late. So as you recall, when we adopted the spending plan, we had just learned about the additional $22 million of state assistance for fringe benefits. That was shown in the original spending plan, sort of at the bottom of the schedule, bringing the entire system into balance. Now that we've adopted a new distribution model, we've distributed those funds, and those funds, coupled with some spending adjustments and, in the case of Central, use of additional HERF funds, have allowed the campuses to present balanced budgets. Western actually shows $2 million surplus in the revised spending plan. That is, I think, appropriate because while it's still preliminary, we believe that they're going to show a small loss for fiscal 21, and this would allow them to immediately make up for that deficit that they experienced in 21 with positive operations in 22, bringing them back to about even on their reserves. Well, obviously I will have more to talk about Western in the coming months. They are in the process of developing a budget sustainability plan to address their steep decline in reserves. But this is, I think, a positive step for them to realign their budget to produce a small operating surplus in fiscal 22. The other campuses, there's a table on page 12 of the agenda package that runs through all the various changes that are reflected in the plan. The one I call your attention to is the drop in tuition and fees, which was quite considerable at $18.8 million for the entire system, offset by positive results on housing and food services. A couple exceptions to all this that I think are worth highlighting. Central has produced is $3.25 million higher than they had originally planned on revenue related to housing and food. That's a very positive step and reflects their significant success in bringing students back onto campus to live. That's been a highlight of our enrollment efforts this fall. In addition, Southern didn't miss their enrollment target appreciably. There's minor adjustments, but basically they are on target for their tuition revenue. I think this is just a reflection of their more cautious approach in the original spending plan than some of the other schools. But this revision allows us to bring all those campuses into balanced operation for the year. In the case of the community colleges, we have seen significant decline in tuition and fees. The original budget included $164 million in tuition and fees, and our revised budget calls for only $144, a drop of just under $20 million for the year. That's offset by an increase in contra revenue that is a reflection of the success of our accounts receivable relief program. As you recall, we used HERF funds at the end of the summer to pay down student debts to the community colleges. And so we no longer, now that that transaction has occurred, we are able to eliminate our budget for uncollectible debt that we normally have to write off from an accounting standpoint at the end of each year. So we went from having a very large uncollectible balance that we would have to write off this coming June 30th to having not zero, but very close to zero of uncollectible debts, and that helps us to achieve balance. That's essentially HERF funds assisting us again. In addition, we've reduced personnel costs, and fringe benefit costs in the revised budget. I think again reflecting the adjuncts and more current information on our hiring. And all in all, this brings us to a revised budget with a very small $3.7 million operating surplus. However, this budget does include, still includes $50 million of HERF funds, one-time HERF funds that we will undoubtedly need to replace with tuition and fee revenue, additional state aid, or spending cuts in next year. That problem hasn't gone away, but it has not become materially worse in this. It's probably about $15 million worse true count, but it's in line with the level of federal one-time funds that we had in the original budget. There are details by region and by university for your interest. I'm happy to take any questions about these budget revisions.
Comments on this by members?
Ben, can you just comment on the process by which this new budget was developed in terms of who was involved in assessing the response to the lower than expected enrollment numbers?
Yes, university budgets were developed, the spending plan revisions were developed by the individual universities, and our involvement was principally around the distribution model work that we passed in the prior item. Other than compiling their requests, the items in front of you reflect the submissions by the individual universities to my office 2 weeks ago in response to their, they'd actually requested earlier in the summer that they believed that revisions were going to be necessary given the trajectory of enrollments. And so that was from that discussion that this item is before you. The community colleges, we asked the regional budget directors, who are, there are 3 of them for the 3 regions of the community colleges. They worked with us to identify spending plan revisions by campus. We did make some, one of the items that's included in the revised spending plan for the colleges is the cost of testing students, unvaccinated students and employees in the spring. We've received a commitment from the state to cover those costs for the fall, but we do not yet have a commitment to cover them in the spring. We ask that the campuses build that in, given the difficulty in projecting what those costs would be. You know, there are a lot of variables that go into how much we're gonna have to spend on testing in the spring. We did work through the regional budget staff, and my office sat down and came up with a uniform methodology for projecting testing costs in the spring based on some assumptions about uptake of vaccinations and costs of tests, et cetera. So other than a few items which we came up with a central calculation for, the revisions to staffing and revisions to OE expenses were generated by the individual campuses in conjunction with the regional budget staff and submitted to us, and we did not change them, other than there were large deficits that were showed there. We ultimately determined the reallocation of HERF funds to support and bring the budget back into balance. That was done centrally, but all the spending items were determined by the campuses themselves, and in fact their revised revenue estimates were based on campus projections of spring enrollment and obviously actual enrollment for the fall.
The resolution that's proposed references Ben that each institution within the approved budget commits to adhering to expenditure control within the spending caps established. Similar question, those expenditure controls, were they developed in conjunction with each institution or otherwise developed?
No, the institutions absolutely developed those the line items within our budget. The level of expenditure control for our spending plans is the level of those line items that you see in the P&Ls that make up our table. So there is a line item for full-time salaries, for part-time salaries, lecturers, you know, various categories of part-time faculty and staff, fringe benefits, utilities, waivers, other expenses. So it's at a pretty high level that the budget is allocated to the individual campuses. Those numbers were developed by the campuses, and those are the numbers to which they must control spending. Those are the caps that they must control spending to under the resolution.
Thank you, Ben.
Any other comments? No other comments?
Yes, I
on
do
this?
have a comment. I'm sorry. It took me a moment to
okay, thanks. David?
Yes. I appreciate Ben's presentation. It really does help to focus on some of the essential numbers because there are many pages of spreadsheets here. And I also appreciate the difficulty in making projections, even to 2024, never mind past that. And so I want to return, for the record, I guess, to a concern that I've expressed on a number of times at this meeting and also at the board, and that is the funding for the guided pathways at the community college level. I note from the June 9th report, Ben, that you made, and it's again something that I've said before, so perhaps it's just repetition, that nonetheless, when we look at the expected hiring of 174 advisors at 5 different levels, advisors 1, advisors 2, supervisors for advisors 2, coordinators for the supervisors, and then folks at the community college, one community college system office. $15.8 million of HERE institutional funds disappears in FY24. And we have this unusual item of pickup of funds of $11.9 million. And moreover, a projection, which I think is overly optimistic by a long shot, of $18.5 million increased revenue through retention for a program which has barely been initiated and is still at the hiring phase. So that's a concern because it does add up to tens of millions of dollars, however you add those numbers. If you add all three numbers, it adds up to something like $40 million, which strikes me as that a good proportion of that will be a shortfall come FY24.
First of all, we are, just as a matter of course, we are right now reviewing our guided pathways projected expenditures. We've learned more about the requirements that this, one of the sources of funding for the guided pathways program that was presented with the spending plan was the state had agreed to some pass-through federal funds that they had received from ARPA to support the guided pathways program. We have since learned more about the process and requirements for those funds, and we may be revising our overall approach and the timing of different funds in order to ensure that we meet the grant requirements for the different categories of funding. So we may, probably during the mid-year budget review, include some new information about our intention for using grant funds on the Guided Pathways program. So those things may change a little bit. We are also, I certainly appreciate that any spending commitment is difficult to make going into a period in which there is a potential large budget shortfall. However, it's my view that the board has clearly expressed their support for the Guided Pathways program for reasons that I think are sound, given the belief that sort of intensive advisement and the creation of academic pathways is the suite of programs that is most effective at improving outcomes in the community college space. And so I continue to think that embracing of that most effective approach is rational and sensible. I appreciate that in times of fiscal distress, decisions must be made by the Board of Regents to prioritize spending at the time, and that those decisions may be in front of you in this coming spring, in the spring of 2022. We may well face difficult prioritizations in the community colleges and in the universities as we try to balance the budgets. In that discussion, I would absolutely include whether guided pathways or system office staff or adjunct faculty or academic departments. All of those are items on which we spend significant resources, and all of them would be subject to review by the Board of Regents as you make decisions about spending priorities. I do not believe that it is reasonable or appropriate to impose a preference for items that are long-standing as opposed to items that are recently enacted in making budget determinations. If a new program is in fact very important to the Board of Regents, then they should continue funding that new program and identify other programs for reductions if those are deemed less important to the outcomes of the system. So I appreciate that we may have to look at guided pathways and everything else that we do in order to balance our budget in the coming year, but I don't believe that holding back those programs now is the right thing to do, because that essentially precludes the Board of Regents from making a full, having the full range of options available to it to balance the budget in the coming year.
Further to that point, I'm not saying that we should throttle back or do anything else, but I'm just expressing a concern that the projections seem unrealistic and that it's going to pose a problem in the tens of millions of dollars in the rather immediate future. The question of advising, if we went into the actual content of it, is I think a fairly complicated one, because it also involves the coordination of advisors with the faculty who actually teach those courses and implement those programs. It includes which has not been mentioned, the role of faculty in advising, which is important, particularly as students become involved in a particular program. And it doesn't include such problems as mentoring by faculty of students, which has been shown to be one of the most effective ways of assuring student retention and graduation, nor does it include the growing problem, which we see both at the universities and the community colleges, of mental health issues and the shortfall that we have in advisors in order to assist those students. So the actual content of the advising question, that's a much more complicated issue. My concern here at the Finance Committee is the unrealistic projections and the cliff which seems to appear in terms of funding in FY24.
David, I think we're going to have to take another look. I think Ben alluded to it next spring. I mean, we've got one-shot dollars that are going to disappear. They're going to be gone, and they're now covering a good deal of the debt, and we're still not out of jail, so to speak, as far as spending goes. And our keys are tuition increases, student increases, which would bring in more tuition and fees, which is absolutely critical. Hopefully right now, as we move forward with the advisors towards spring, some of that will begin to change. But as Ben mentioned, we're going to have to take a look at many things come next spring, put them on the table, including tuition increases, fee increases, program adjustments or cuts or consolidations in the colleges and universities. Not something I think many people want to do. I don't think I would like to. Members of this committee don't want to see anything like that happen. But what's real and what is there and how we can handle it is where we will end up, and we take another look with Ben and his group as we move into the next semester.
Well, and on that point, I also, I would remind you that we are in the process of developing a revenue and cost model for the community colleges, which I anticipate will be done we'll have a first view of it probably in November, and I'm hoping that the whole model will be done in December or early January, and that will allow us to look very carefully across the community college system at the costs and revenue that are being generated by all sorts of programs, whether it's advisement or academic programs or support programs that are there across the colleges. So we will have, I think, more information and capacity available in a timely way, I believe, to make some of the difficult decisions that may be necessary going forward. And I want to circle back, Professor Blitz, you mentioned at the beginning of your question the difficulty in making projections. I will tell you that as my job requires me to make projections, which have been since March of 2020 consistently wrong. So I am batting 1,000 that I consistently cannot see the future. COVID has made it very, very difficult to think about how enrollment is going to recover or respond. I certainly welcome insights that others can provide. If nothing else, it gives me the sense that I can share the blame for our failed ability to, our cloudy crystal ball is something we all have to deal with. It makes decision-making in the current environment even more difficult when it's so hard to predict whether it's levels of state aid or levels of enrollment. These are enormous challenges that we face now.
On that point, then, let me just say that you're very modest, and let me just make the point here that I am trusting that the people who are putting these numbers together, these projections, have a much better degree of information and professional judgment about whether it's enrollment or expenses or student-related costs or the cost of providing guided pathways, because it's in large part, as it is with you, Ben, their job. And while this board and this committee should be focused on governance and should be focused on monitoring, I don't want to get in the business as board members of second guessing professionals whose job it is to make these kinds of projections. We understand, or we should understand, in my view, as board members, that the people who are making these projections do so with as much information that is available, taking into account their job, their role in the organization, and working with their peer level professionals at the other institutions within the system. So I do have a great regard for the process, and I think you've heard me ask a number of times who was involved, who's seen the numbers, because I think, frankly, it's ridiculous to sit on this committee and to pretend to have greater information about what's going to happen in 2024. So I'm trusting the process, and I'm trusting the judgment that's exercised by you and others. And for the record, I think it's important to state that you haven't been missing. You've been doing the best under circumstances that change every single day, it seems, for the last 2 years.
No, I appreciate that, and I will tell you that the projections that we have for this year, so that includes the actual enrollment for the fall and our projections of enrollment for the spring, I have a high degree of confidence in those projections. I mean, we have a pretty good idea of what the COVID circumstances are going to be like in January. I mean, could they be a little bit better, a little bit worse? Of course. Or there could be some other, the gamma variant or something else could change the dynamic. But we have pretty good, I mean, the information about enrollment and our resources this year are significantly better in these revised budget requests than they were in the original, because we've learned a great deal and we have actual enrollment for the fall to support our projections, and we have actual employment and actual expenditures during the first quarter of the fiscal year to support our projections for the current year. I think where we all have to have some humility is in our thinking about what's going to happen in 23 and 24. So we are, in my view, we are trying to provide the best projections we can, as well as, I think increasingly, it is my goal to provide information to you about the areas where we have limited information, or the areas where there is exposure to unforeseen events that we should be mindful of. And so I certainly appreciate your support, Regent Jimenez, and we'll continue to do our best to give you the best view of the future, understanding that the near future is our sweet spot. The distant future gets a little murkier. So thank you.
Thank you, David. And Ben and Melantine and their team do an outstanding job, and you're absolutely correct in that, David. You know, as I look at this again, we're going to end up trying to come up with a spending plan with revisions, et cetera, in a moment. You know, I look at this committee, and I've served on it for many, many years, and you almost have to be a masochist to serve on it. We have never had positive things to do where we can really take care of the faculty. We take care of the staff, take care of the student body that we're most interested in and providing the kind of services that they want and need. And, you know, I thank you all for that, from that perspective. And the people such as Ben and his team that has to deal with these kinds of numbers and not being able to come up with positive things that we could do. It's always either cutting or raising costs, raising tuition and fees, which is a very thankless job which we have. But I thank you all for serving on it, and thank you all for understanding. And you're correct, and this group that does these numbers have been doing it for years and have provided the best information they can with the resources available. So with that, if there are no other further comments, I would ask for a motion to adopt a resolution for the 2022 spending plan revisions for the Connecticut State Colleges and Universities.
I'll move.
Second.
Second.
Thank you, Joanne. Thank you. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The resolution's adopted. Thank you. The last item we have is an information item dealing with the naming policies. This is something that continues to raise its head over the years, now and then, how we go about it, who qualifies, et cetera. And so if Ben would briefly, excuse me, I'm sorry, Pamela. You're on mute, Pamela.
This one is mine. This one, I've been, back in, when I first came on board, Alice Pritchard asked me to resurrect the project, to update a naming policy for the board, as the, previous team who had been working on it hadn't really addressed it in 2 to 2.5 years. And we had policies on the books that dated back for the community colleges all the way back to 2006, and for the universities all the way back to 2009. And we needed to take some action in terms of what the board was charging the universities on one hand and the community colleges on another to actually do. So you see in front of you a resolution, an almost final draft policy, as well as a staff report, which outlines the chronology of the work that's been conducted to date, the number of people who have had their fingers in the pie in terms of wordsmithing this, and ensuring that the universities have as much autonomy in terms of prospect development, and the community colleges have an appropriate community college autonomy for prospect development, for naming of major facilities and academic programs for their particular campuses. There's also in the staff report a summary of the kinds of things that have changed since the 2006 and 2009 policies. Specifically, we have stripped out the procedural aspects of the old policies and really created a policy which charges the universities to create their cohesive procedures for universities, and charges the community colleges on their side of the business to create procedures that they can all adhere to, so that the board isn't deep in the weeds in terms of how they go about doing it, only that when it comes to the board for final approval, we know that the package is complete and all the steps have been taken on the campus side. In addition, we've created as much autonomy as possible for the universities and the community colleges to identify the fundraising goals and priorities, which constitute what they believe for their market and what their market will support would be a substantial donation. And on a worksheet, each campus would submit to Ben's office what the target numbers are, so that when we get a donation from a community college for a major naming of a major building, we know that that is what their market can support. Community college donor development is different from donor development on a university campus. So we've created a structure where the campuses tell the board, well, the finance committee, what they believe their best donor development strategy would be. We've also separated out what kinds of control in terms of naming opportunities the campus can control and what does need to come to the board. So those are also some big changes in terms of the old procedures that are there. We've also included new language for the unnaming of buildings, and what constitutes the board's right to terminate a naming opportunity. We've included new opportunities for naming virtual and online programs that we didn't have before, and including language for naming recognition to reflect historic or cultural or academic or geographic associations with different people. So what we have asked each of the committees to do is go through, ask questions, wordsmith if you think it needs to be recrafted, and get us feedback. Our goal is to present this to the board in December and have it out into the world for the universities and community colleges to begin their procedural development starting the first of the year. So if you could take a gander at that and send me any feedback within the next 30 days, any questions that you have in terms of why things were done, and you know, who we modeled particular phraseology after, and those kinds of things. I can certainly answer that. Any questions that you have now or going forward over the next 30 days. That's it for me.
Any other questions? Thank you, Pam. That was concise because it's been up in the air over the years. I've served on this board for many years, and it fluctuates as to what dollar amounts you need to do and what prerequisites are necessary if you're not a contributor of funds, but what you've done for the system or the university or the college, and putting those in place somehow seems to be the right thing to do. And we become more consistent so nobody could say, well, you did this over here, why are you changing that now over there? So thank you for that, and thank you for that input. Anybody else comments at all for Pam? If not, I would entertain a motion to adjourn the meeting. Is there such a motion?
So moved.
Thank you, David. Second. Thank you, Joanne. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. All have a great day. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
I am stopping the live stream. Thank you. Your live stream has stopped.